They were dragged in chains through jeering crowds, spat on, cursed, their hair torn by angry hands. Female pirates, women who had once commanded the seas with pistols at their hips and daggers in their belts, now reduced to trembling figures, marched toward a courtroom that had already decided their fate. To be a pirate was already a death sentence, but to be a woman and a pirate, that was a crime so unnatural, so monstrous in the eyes of the 17th and 18th century world, that no mercy was possible. Imagine the terror. A wooden courtroom stinking of sweat, tobacco, and ink. Naval officers sitting stiff in their uniforms, their faces masks of contempt. And in the center, a woman accused not only of piracy, but of violating the very order of nature itself. Her voice meant nothing. Her innocence meant nothing. The trial was a performance, a sick theater meant to end with one inevitable line: guilty. Death, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, Mary Critchett. Names that history remembers, but only because their defiance was so loud it could not be silenced. Most others didn't even get that. Their stories vanished with the noose. But the pattern was always the same. The courts stripped them of humanity, turned them into warnings, then crushed their bodies with pain so public, so brutal, that entire generations grew up terrified of becoming the next example. You see, the Admiralty Courts were never courts at all. They were execution factories. No jury. No chance to argue. The evidence was little more than the word of captains or sailors who hated them. And every time a woman pirate stood before those men, she was treated like a witch who had dared step into a world forbidden to her sex. Her punishment wasn't just death. It was humiliation, degradation. A deliberate attempt to erase every shred of dignity she once had. Picture the march to execution dock in London. Newgate Prison's heavy doors swing open, and the condemned are loaded onto carts, paraded through crowded streets under armed guard. Drums beat. Children scream insults. Rotten food is hurled. For the women, the insults cut deeper. For devil, monster. And yet some of them, Anne Bonny especially, spat back at the crowd, unbroken even as the rope tightened around her neck. But the British were not merciful in their killing. At the gallows of Wapping, overlooking the cold waters of the Thames, there was no quick fall to snap the neck. No. The short drop method was used, a cruel technique that left the body thrashing and choking for minutes on end. They called it the marshal's dance, because the condemned would convulse grotesquely, their legs jerking, their tongues protruding, until finally the body sagged in silence. Imagine a woman's skirts twisting in the air as she kicked, her face turning purple, her fingernails clawing at the rope, while a crowd of thousands cheered like it was theater. And it didn't always end there. Sometimes, if the crime was severe enough, the bodies were left dangling for days. The tide would rise and fall, washing over swollen corpses until the sea itself claimed them. Other times, the worst offenders were gibbeted, their bodies chained in iron cages, left to rot in public as birds tore at their flesh. Male pirates suffered this more often, but the threat hung heavy over women too. The message was clear: piracy would not be forgiven, not by God, not by man, and especially not by empire. And yet, the rope was almost merciful compared to what many women endured before it. Some were flogged until their backs were nothing but strips of bloody meat, their screams echoing through harbors as the Cato. 9 tails ripped flesh from bone. Picture it: a woman tied to a wooden post, stripped to the waist, each lash carving trenches into her skin, while the crowd jeered and officials calmly counted out the strikes. Her body was not just punished. It was turned into a spectacle, a lesson, a warning carved into living flesh. But the most horrific fate wasn't always the gallows, or even the whip. Some women were not executed at all. Instead, they were quietly erased, forced into slavery, sold as concubines, absorbed into the very colonial system they had once fought against. Imagine the terror of being captured in the Caribbean, not to face the rope, but to be handed over to a merchant, a governor, or a planter. Your freedom stolen, your name erased, your body turned into property. For these women, death might have been kinder. Others rotted away on prison ships, floating hells moored in harbors, where disease festered in the dark. Shackled in the bowels of rotting hulks, women pirates coughed themselves to death, starved, or were exploited by guards. Their stories weren't recorded in bold ink like Bonny or Reed. They simply disappeared, lost to silence, forgotten by design. History wants you to believe that piracy ended on the gallows, but the truth is far darker. The punishments weren't about justice. They were about control. They were about crushing women who dared to defy not just laws, but the very roles society demanded of them. And the cruelty didn't end with their bodies. It was designed to poison memory itself, to make sure no one ever thought a woman could be free upon the sea again. Not all female pirates went to the gallows with the dignity of a final speech. Many met their end broken long before the rope. Take the case of Mary Critchett. Captured in 1729 after joining a desperate crew of escaped convicts, her trial was swift. No defense, no sympathy. She was marched to the gallows in Virginia. Hanged without delay, her name erased almost as quickly as the life left her body. No famous transcript survived. No legends built her story. She was simply another corpse swinging in the wind. Proof that the law did not waste time on women who dared to live as men. But worse were those who didn't even get the dignity of a trial. In colonial ports, captured women were sometimes flogged until they collapsed, only to be sold into servitude afterward. Imagine standing bloodied in front of a crowd, back flayed open, salt air burning the wounds, while the very men who condemned you eyed you as property. There was no courtroom, no sentence, no final words, just a slow erasure into slavery. Your pirate flag torn away, your identity drowned forever in the silence of plantation life. And then there were the prison ships, floating tombs, rotting hulks anchored in harbors, filled with the stench of sewage, sweat, and sickness. Women pirates chained in those dark holds suffered not minutes of pain, but weeks, months, even years of torment. Shackled in damp darkness, their skin eaten by lice, their lungs choked by disease, they wasted away until their bodies were unrecognizable. The guards, brutal men with unchecked power, used them however they wished. Some women died screaming. Others died quietly, forgotten, their bones thrown overboard with no marker, no prayer. Execution dock, at least, was quick. But the floating prisons, that was cruelty designed to last. And then came the spectacle of flogging. The whip was not just a punishment. It was theater. The cat-o'-nine, tails tore chunks of skin from the back, each lash spraying blood in arcs across cobblestones. Crowds gathered not in horror, but in excitement. Children clapped, vendors sold ale, sailors jeered, and the women screamed until their voices broke, their backs nothing but rivers of blood. Some fainted, some collapsed. But the lash never stopped until the sentence was complete. And even after the flesh healed, if it healed, the scars remained. Jagged reminders carved into their bodies, proof to all who saw them that this was a woman who had dared to break the law, a living warning, branded in blood. But sometimes, death was not just punishment, it was a performance. The Admiralty understood that the crowd needed more than justice. They needed horror. So the executions of female pirates were staged like theater. Picture Anne Bonny, standing at the gallows in 1720, her eyes blazing with fury. She had fought, she had killed, she had commanded ships alongside Calico Jack. And now, as he stood condemned beside her, she spat venom at him. If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog. The crowd roared at her defiance, but her words cut deeper than any blade. Bonny and Mary Reed pleaded the belly, claiming pregnancy to delay their deaths. It worked for a time. But most women had no such shield. They were dragged to the rope regardless of belly, regardless of cries. Some were hanged while their infants grew inside them, the empire proving it had no mercy, not even for the unborn. And when the rope tightened, There was no clean snap, no mercy of a broken neck. The marshal's dance awaited them, a choking, thrashing agony that turned every second into eternity. Their legs kicked, skirts twisted, tongues bulged purple, and eyes rolled as the crowd watched every convulsion. Some laughed, some cried, but none forgot. That was the point, and if death was not enough, the bodies themselves became instruments of terror. Some corpses were chained in cages and left to rot by the tide, faces eaten by birds, ribs gnawed by fish, the sea washing over their remains again and again. Even in death, the women were denied peace. Their bodies were warnings, silent, swaying reminders that piracy was unforgivable. The message was clear for women who dared to seize freedom on the sea. There would be no mercy, no escape, and no remembrance. Only blood, rope, and silence. Not every female pirate ended with the rope, the whip, or the prison ship. Some endured something worse, survival. For those captured but not condemned to death, their punishment was a life sentence of silence. Many were sold back into slavery, dragged to the colonies they had once plundered. Imagine it. A woman who once commanded men, who once raised steel against merchant ships, reduced to a servant in chains, her body broken under the sun. No gallows, no last words, just decades of labor until her bones gave out in some sugar field. Others were forced into concubinage, handed over to officers, governors, or soldiers, to be kept alive not for justice, but for pleasure. Their identities stripped away, their pirate names forgotten, their memories erased. And with each night of humiliation, the empire drove the point deeper. No woman could dare rise above her station without being broken back into it. Some simply vanished, goods disappear, names scratched out, trial documents burned. It was deliberate. Erasure was its own kind of execution, the slow killing of memory. If the rope took their lives, silence took their legacy. And yet, whispers remain. A few names survived. Anne Bonny, Mary Read. Not because of mercy, but because their stories were too explosive, too scandalous, to be buried completely. Even then, their endings were twisted by rumor. Some say Bonny escaped. Some say Read died of fever in prison. The truth, lost. And maybe that was the point. Because for every Bonny and Read, there were dozens, maybe hundreds, of unnamed women pirates who were never recorded, never remembered. Women who bled, who fought, who died screaming in chains, their names eaten by the sea. Their absence is the most chilling detail of all. And think about this. When the last rope tightened around a pirate's neck at execution dock, when the last body swayed in the salty wind, it wasn't just a death. It was theater. It was the empire telling the world, this is what happens to women who break our laws, our rules, our order. The sound of the crowd cheering as the body twitched, the stink of rot as the corpse hung in its cage, the silence after the bones fell apart and washed away. That was the true sentence. Not just death, but oblivion. And that, perhaps, is the most brutal execution of all. To be erased so completely that history itself forgets you ever lived.